emergency spending since the pandemic began roughly a year ago, or at least the first bill was passed about 1 year ago today. What I thought I would do is give a very high level overview of some of the key things that are in this bill, and then also talk about some of the things that members of Congress and the White House are looking to move on to next, and what could take up a lot of the rest of the year. Happy to take questions as I'm speaking, also happy to take questions at the end, whatever you all prefer. I'll start by saying this. It normally takes months or even years to pass legislation that costs a fraction of what the American Rescue Plan costs. And in this case, congressional leaders were able to take up and pass this bill in the matter of about 6 weeks. Why is that? It's because they used a process called budget reconciliation. And this is a process that not a lot of people know about. It's not used very often. The political climate has to be just right. Budget reconciliation is limited in scope. It can only include items that directly affect the revenue of the US government, and it can only be used once per fiscal year. And I'll apologize right now about my dog if that's bothersome. Sorry about that. The reason budget reconciliation is important here is because in the Senate, it allows congressional leaders to pass a bill with a simple majority, rather than have to go through regular order. And the reason that's important is because if you have to go through regular order, you need 60 senators in order to cut off debate. Early on in the process, really after President Biden was sworn in, he got together with congressional leaders and made the decision that the Democrats were not going to be able to convince 10 Republican senators to vote for the package. And so they decided early on that they were going to make this a partisan affair. What that meant is that Republican members of Congress, frankly, provided very little input into what was in this bill, but it likely shaved months off the process. I think we'd still be talking about the COVID relief bill rather than talking about implementation if they really did try to make this a bipartisan bill. The fact is that things in Washington generally don't happen quickly. And if you try to do things in a bipartisan way, that involves compromise, and that just takes a lot longer. It's a reality of legislating. There's a lot in this bill in general. There's a lot for the state of Washington, and there's a lot for Clallam County. Like I said, I'm not going to go through everything. I'm going to give you a pretty high level overview, but I thought it would be useful to cover some of the big ticket items that are in the American Rescue Plan. So first, I think it's worth noting that roughly half of what's in the $1.9 trillion bill goes to low income individuals and families, which makes this bill one of the largest social safety net programs that Congress has ever taken up. And this includes money for stimulus checks, and it includes money for unemployment benefits, child tax credits, a whole slew of things. With respect to the stimulus checks, I think that's maybe the most high profile part of the American Rescue Plan. And I think a lot of people know the details, but I'll go through them anyway. And I think some people have already started receiving these checks in the mail or through direct deposit, but individuals that make less than $75,000 annually are going to receive a $1,400 check. For married couples who file jointly, they each receive a $1,400 check as long as their combined income is below $150,000. This phases out at $80,000 for individuals, $160,000 for married couples. And then in addition, children and adult dependents are eligible for another $1,400. And so this piece accounts for really a pretty large chunk of the overall $1.9 trillion cost of the bill. The bill also extends enhanced unemployment benefits through September 6th. So these are the $300 payments on top of what individuals receive through the state. The bill also increases the $2,000 child tax credit to $3,600 for children under 6 and to $3,000 for children aged 6 to 17. This is something to watch. I think that, so this particular increase is slated to expire after 1 year, but I think for this and for many other pieces of this bill, I think you're going to see members of Congress really try to extend some of these provisions for much longer, if not permanently. And I think this might be one that you could see extended for a much longer period of time. The bill provides $130 billion for K through 12 schools to pay for the cost of reopening. I'll say this, I'm the president of the board of my kid's school this year, and we are already talking about what it's going to take to reopen in the fall. And it's a complicated process and it's expensive. So I think that this money is going to go a real long ways for a lot of school districts around the state and around the country. The bill allocates billions of dollars for vaccine distribution and COVID testing and contact tracing. And it includes money for reimbursing hospitals for lost revenue that's related to the pandemic. And there's money for small business. Probably the most high profile pot of money in there, or at least the one that got the most attention, at least here in DC, is $25 billion that is included for small restaurants and chains. And then there's the money that flows directly to states, counties, cities, and tribes. This particular pot, which is $350 billion, frankly, is the primary reason we didn't see any COVID relief package go through Congress between the CARES Act, which passed in March or April, I forget which month, and December, which was the most recent COVID bill before we got to this one. And the reason is that, unfortunately, this has been a partisan issue. Democrats in general, and I'll say that throughout this, I'll talk about Democrats, I'll talk about Republicans. When I talk about things, I try to keep things generally nonpartisan. I tend to operate in a generally nonpartisan way. But unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., sometimes things fall into two camps. In this case, Democrats generally wanted to push for money for states, counties, and cities and tribes. And in general, Republicans didn't want to provide this funding. And over the course of the summer, the Democrats and Republicans who came together to try to pass COVID relief, they came pretty close. And in almost all cases, this was the pot of money that ultimately prevented them from reaching a deal. So again, $350 billion for states, counties, cities, and tribes. For Washington, what this means is that the state will receive roughly $4.25 billion. All of Washington counties combined are going to receive about $1.5 billion, and Washington cities are going to receive around $1.2 billion. According to estimates that I've seen from the congressional committees, Clallam County should receive approximately $15 million, and then Port Angeles, Sequim, and Forks will receive 4.1, 1.6, and roughly $840,000 respectively. It's worth noting that state and local governments have quite a bit more time to spend this particular pot of money than states and local governments had to spend a similar pot of money under the CARES Act. So the CARES Act also included money through the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And at first, at least, states and local governments only had a matter of months to spend this money. Well, I think members of Congress learned the lesson. And as a result, the American Rescue Plan dollars can be used to cover costs that are incurred by states, counties, cities, tribes through December 31, 2024. So it gives state and local government plenty of time, I think, to spend this money. It also makes this particular pot of money a lot more flexible than the money that was included through the CARES Act. The list of eligible expenses is just a lot more expansive than it was under CARES. I want to note that there are some things that I think are notably missing from the COVID bill, things that I was involved in pushing for that I think could have impacted certain organizations within Clallam County, including Blackball. One is CERTS Act funding. So this was the money there was money for CERTS included in the bill back in December that would go to private motor coach and bus companies, private ferries, and other similar types of organizations. Despite pushing, there was no additional money for CERTS in the COVID bill, the American Rescue Plan. And then we also pushed for emergency funding for ports and other maritime transportation interests, money that would be flowed through a program that is being stood up as a result of the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Act, MT-SARA. We pushed pretty hard on behalf of the port, on behalf of Blackball, working with the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association, other regional port and maritime groups, working with the American Association of Port Authorities. And ultimately, I think it came down to a few things. With regards to CERTS, unfortunately, that $2 billion was included in the bill in December for motor coach companies and ferries. None of that money has been distributed by Treasury yet, not a dime. And the thinking in Congress was that they were not inclined to provide additional money for this account when the money that was provided back in December had not yet been released. And with respect to the MT-SARA, the maritime money, I think there is a perception that ports and other maritime interests are generally doing well because they see the biggest ports in America, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and Seattle and Tacoma and Savannah and Charleston, all doing pretty well. There's a ton of port congestion around the country. You've got ships lined up outside of LA and Long Beach, and the perception on the Hill was that ports are okay. We tried our darndest to explain that the port of Port Angeles is not like the port of Los Angeles, but to no avail. But I'll say that we're going to continue pushing for that particular money. So with the bill now being passed, attention is going to turn to flowing the money out to all of the places that it needs to go. And I have a feeling that we're going to see some mixed results here. I think some of this money is going to go up pretty quickly. I think that's especially true of the money that's flowing through existing formulas, or if we're talking about an extension of programs that were created by previous COVID bill, CARES or some of the others. But for anything new, I think that it could take weeks or even months for money to get out the bill. The CERTS Act is a prime example of that. Here we are, March 17th, so almost 3 months after the December COVID bill passed, and motor coach companies, ferries haven't seen a dime of that money. With the task of distributing this money now being handed off to the executive branch, congressional leaders are already looking at what happens next. So that's the COVID bill. I'm happy to take questions on that, but there's also a lot of discussion now about the next big thing. And I think a lot of people think that next big thing could be infrastructure. I will say that people in Washington and around the country have been talking about trying to get a big infrastructure bill through Congress since at least 2009, when President Obama was first elected. And here we are still talking about it. But I do think that things could be different this year. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First, I do think that you have a desire in Congress to continue spending money. I think that we're going to see a lot more concern about inflationary pressures and budget deficits as the year goes on. Again, $6.2 trillion has been spent on COVID relief since the beginning of the pandemic. But I also think that there's a recognition, at least in some places, that $6 trillion was relief. It was intended to stem the bleeding. And that in order to get out of the hole that was created by the economic downturn, we're going to need to do things that create jobs and generate revenue. And not to be cynical about it, but as Obama's first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, once famously said, you never let a serious crisis go to waste. The real reason, though, that I think we might actually be able to get an infrastructure bill done this year is the same reason that we just saw a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill get signed into law, budget reconciliation. So again, an obscure sort of congressional process that allows you to do really big things. I do think there's going to be an honest effort to make infrastructure a bipartisan bill. President Obama he campaigned on bipartisanship. He was sworn in. He said he was going to try to work with the Republicans. He said, look, I was in the Senate for a really long time. I know how to get things done. I know how to work with the other side. It's imperative that we do. I think they're going to make an honest effort. And as a result, I think we're going to be talking about infrastructure for the rest of the year, because again, when you try to legislate on a bipartisan basis, that just takes time. But I also think, and we're seeing hints of this already, I think that reality is going to set in at some point. And I think that Democratic leaders are going to have to decide to ditch bipartisanship in order to get something done here. With that being said, I will note that neither Democrats nor Republicans have a monopoly on partisanship. And while budget reconciliation is a tool you can only use when you control the House, the Senate, and the White House, it's a tool that you use if you control the House, the Senate, and the White House. It's how we got the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. It's how we got the Affordable Care Act in 2010. It's how we got the Trump tax cuts in 2017. And it's how we might be able to get infrastructure in 2021. Ironically, in order to get infrastructure, we may see at least a partial undoing of the Trump tax cuts. So by the end of the year, we may see a lot of money for roads and bridges, transit, maritime, broadband, schools, green energy. I think we're going to see that infrastructure is going to be defined very broadly here. But I also think you're going to see the corporate tax rate go up. I think you could see taxes raised on high income individuals in order to pay for that bill. An interesting thing about the infrastructure bill and about the FY22 appropriations process in general is that it appears that Congress may be bringing back earmarks for the first time since 2010. Call it community projects, call it earmarks, call it member-driven spending. Really what this means is an opportunity for members of Congress to direct spending to specific organizations and specific projects back in their districts. And they haven't been able to do this for a decade. It doesn't look like Congress is going to open the floodgates here. And it actually doesn't look like it's a sure thing. But members of the House, including Congressman Kilmer, are asking government entities, tribes, special districts, and certain types of nonprofits to submit earmark requests. I have to say, I was around before the earmark ban went in place in 2011. And this process this year is going to be a lot different. There's going to be a lot more restrictions than there have been in the past. First, members of Congress, including Derek Kilmer, are only going to be able to submit 10 requests to the Appropriations Committee, and that's across 12 appropriations bills. So 10 requests for their entire district across 12 bills. And then the Appropriations Committee is limiting the number of programs from which money can be earmarked from. This means that the process is going to be highly competitive if you have a project that actually fits into one of the programs that the committee says you can actually pull an earmark from. For the infrastructure bill, which they're also planning to earmark for at least highway and transit projects, there are also going to be hard and fast rules, starting with the fact that projects need to be part of the STIP or the TIP. And I think that alone is going to disqualify potentially tens of thousands of projects around the country, again, making that process highly competitive. I think the fact is, a lot of you have probably heard this news, have been tracking the earmark discussion for months and are preparing to get your forms in to Congressman Kilmer by his deadline on Monday, or to other House members. But I think everyone needs to be warned that we may not see earmarks this year. I think there's a lot of hope, but there's no guarantee. The reason is that Senate leadership hasn't made a final decision yet because they're still trying to navigate the politics of earmarks and decide whether the politics are good for Democrats or bad for Democrats. At the moment, I'm told there's not enough support in the Senate to bring earmarks back. And what that means is that if the House does, it doesn't matter, because if you can't get a bill through the Senate with earmarks, then you can't have earmarks. But again, it all remains to be seen. I think you've seen time and again that politics can turn on a dime depending on what's happening at the time. In fact, a good example of this is that I heard this morning that House Republicans, who so far have not said they're going to participate in the earmarking process, are getting together as a caucus, and they plan to vote to approve members participating in the process. In other words, seeking earmarks. And if that's the case, that could put a lot of pressure on the Senate to follow suit. So we'll see. But if you're looking to seek money for a project, if you were thinking about submitting a form to Congressman Kilmer or to another member, you should absolutely do that and hope that we can actually get through the process with earmarks intact. So with that, I'll end there. I know I covered a lot. I didn't cover everything, so I'm happy to take any questions that people may have.
There we go. Thank you, Ray. We do have a question from Lena. Lena, do you want to ask your question there?
Sure. My question is whether or not there's any restrictions on how the funding to the state, counties, and cities can be spent. And is it expected that part of this funding will be used to support businesses locally?
Yeah, so I'll just go through the eligible uses. In the bill itself, the money, the eligibility or eligible uses of this money is spelled out very, very specifically. So first, the money can be used to respond to, I'm just gonna read this because it's a lot easier and it's not really that long. There are about 4 eligible uses here. So first, you can use the money, states, local governments, cities, tribes, to respond to the public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus pandemic. And that includes assistance to households, assistance to small businesses, assistance to nonprofits, and aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitalities. So that is very broad. And it's going to be up to the Department of Treasury to determine exactly what that looks like. And it's also the reason that we may see the Department of Treasury take some time to figure this all out, because they're going to need to give guidance to states and counties and cities and tribes. And the fact is that, like I said at the beginning, the flexibility with this money, associated with this money, is a lot greater than the flexibility that was associated with the coronavirus relief fund money that was included in the CARES Act. Second, the money can be used to respond to workers that are performing essential work by providing premium pay to eligible workers, or providing grants to eligible employers that have eligible workers that perform eligible work. Again, sort of vague, something that Treasury is going to have to put a finer point on. Money can be used for the provision of government services to the extent that reduction in revenue due to COVID-19 affected that. So public services, including public health and things like that. This was something that was hard fought during the CARES Act debate and ultimately left out. Basically, this notion of revenue replacement, which frankly was the biggest issue that states, cities, counties, companies were dealing with at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think still struggle with. So this is effectively revenue replacement. And then, surprising to me, ineligible uses to make necessary investments in water, sewer, broadband infrastructure, which again was something that was not included in the CARES Act money. So very, very broad, lots of flexibility, but also going to be subject to guidance from Treasury.
Okay, I saw that there was in total 30 billion for public transit, and then about 300 million for transit within that 300 million for transit in rural areas. And then there was also some about buses and others. There's no opportunity there for Blackball to receive any of that money. As I was reading it, I thought this could apply to Blackball, but is public transportation defined as owned by a public entity or available openly to the public?
Owned and operated. The money that $30 billion will be distributed by the Federal Transit Administration through existing formulas. And so the money is going to flow to those public transit operators, whether it's ferries or buses or rail, that already receive money through FTA formula programs.
I believe Clallam Transit got $4.5 million in the CARES Act, so I would assume it'll be more this time around. So they should be well cared for.
Yeah, this number is bigger. You know, transit, like the airlines. So in terms of transportation, the Congress has been pretty consistent in trying to take care of the airlines and airports, at least the major hubs, and transit. And frankly, one of the main reasons for that is that Senator Chuck Schumer, who's the majority leader in the Senate, he has some big transit operators in the state that have seen significant declines in their revenue and need a lot of help. And so all politics is local, but by virtue of Senator Schumer trying to help out his transit operators, he gets to help out transit operators around the country.
Mm-hmm. So I'm a port commissioner, you have a contract with our port. Is there money specifically for port districts?
There is also flexibility that's baked into the $350 billion that flow to states and local governments to flow that money to special districts, which include ports, and to other certain types of nonprofits and organizations that provide some transportation services. I think, again, that ability to pass money through to other organizations, Treasury will have to put a finer point on that, and it will be up to Governor Inslee. But yes, indirectly, the port can receive some of this money, but it will be up to the discretion of the governor. And I know that in some states, there are already efforts underway to put pressure on their governors. Down in Oregon, I know that special districts have already been lobbying the state legislature and Governor Brown to put pressure on her to not only flow money to these other organizations, but to do it sooner rather than later. I'll say that, Governor Inslee, I'm not I'm not sure how quickly he moved with CARES Act money compared to other governors, but I'll tell you that there was a lot of frustration with Governor Brown, who did not move nearly as fast as Governor Inslee did.
Okay. Rod, do you have a question?
Yeah, good morning to both of you, Colleen and Ray. Ray, so will we see any changes in the way that federal agencies and their processes will be overseeing these funds and making sure it kind of flows seamlessly to the states? The CARES Act put a lot of funds out there, but as a few of us here in Clallam County know, some of those funds became a little challenging to access, and I don't think we've still accessed all of them that were allocated. So it's a concern that we might see additional processes from the feds, or can the states also impose additional processes on those funds?
I think it remains to be seen. The fact is that while we should have a certain amount of experience, lessons learned from the distribution of the CARES Act money, as we went through, the way you can use this particular bucket of money is different. And so that's going to create additional challenges. And you have a new administration that may just have a different philosophy or a different way of doing things. So I think that's a long way of saying that we just don't know.
The lawyer answer, it depends.
Yeah. When in doubt, just say it depends. But in this case, it has the benefit of being true. So
Ray, there's $15 billion in there for child care and development block grant programs. And I assume that's similar to community development block grants. And then there's also almost $24 billion for child care stabilization. And then there's another tranche of funding towards the end for child care. I'm for child care assistants and child care workers. Is that funding going, do you know if that funding will be like just, you have to apply to HUD as an individual, or will it be coming to our state agency that handles that, DCYF? Do you know much about that, or is that just something I should research because it's not your area?
So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that in general, when putting these big bills together, what the congressional leaders have tried to do, what committee leaders have tried to do, is utilize existing funding channels. So whether it's existing formulas or grant programs already in place, they do want to try to flow this money as efficiently as possible. And that means they've tried not to reinvent the wheel. And so if you take a close look at those programs, if you look at how that money normally flows, that's how the money is going to flow. And I think that for the most part, if you look at those sections of the bill, which I'll be honest, I haven't, they're relatively prescriptive. And to the extent that they're not as prescriptive, it's likely because there are already existing mechanisms or formulas in place.
Mm-hmm. So just so everybody knows, I'm going through all of the bill. I've got it in Word, and I am not addressing any sections that have to do with individual taxes, but business taxes and anything on childcare throughout, government funding. And I'm going to post that information under different sections on our Choose Clallam First here by next week for certain, but I'm trying to get that done as soon as possible so that you can reference it much easier than through the huge font PDF that you find on the Congress site. So hopefully that can be helpful to everyone going forward. Let's see. So what other questions? Lena, not Lena. It looks like Debbie, you have some questions?
Well, one was a statement, and then there is questions. Unemployment from the federal government. The additional $300 has been being paid out on extended benefits. What is the provision if the state extended benefits end because they've used a full year of unemployment benefits? Is that going to be extended through the state, or is the $300 just going to go directly from the federal government to the unemployed individual?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know if that's spelled out in the bill. There's a lot of deference given to the states. And so it may be up to the state to determine how to get that money to the individual, but that's something I just don't know. I'll say too, what Colleen is doing with respect to summarizing this bill and making that available to you, that's a really great service, because when these things get passed, and this has been true of every COVID bill that we've seen, we, people like me, scramble to get the various summaries from all of the committees that have put something into this bill. And oftentimes you're looking at a handful to a dozen or more committees that all contribute to this. They all have different styles and summaries. None of them are particularly helpful. And then and a lot of them aren't made public. And then once the bill gets passed, they move on to the next thing. And there's never one big comprehensive summary other than maybe what press tries to put together. So what Colleen is doing for you is hugely valuable, because there are very few other places where you can get summaries like that.
Thanks, Ray. Hey, I know Bruce Beckett is probably one of our state's best experts on unemployment benefits and the trust fund. So Bruce, can you answer Debbie's question?
I think so. Ray would know the specifics, but these federal packages have continued to fund extended unemployment insurance benefits. And typically what happens is that the extended benefits, both in time and the benefit amounts, that money is injected to the state employment security department and used to pay for those extended benefit programs. So it doesn't come out of the state's trust fund or the taxes that you pay as a business. It comes out of the federal dollars that come into the unemployment system. I don't know if that answered the question, but it's the money goes directly into that fund to pay that.
Colleen, the example I'm using, of course, is my son. He's been collecting from the state $256 for his unemployment benefits, and they've added the $300 to it. Yep. So, but he received a notice that as of last Saturday, those $256 benefits were going away because they were extended benefits. And he asked the question, he goes, well, does that mean I just get $300 from the federal government if I have to stay out because I'm, you know, one of the groups that can't really take the vaccine, or, you know, he's got other compromising issues?
Yeah, that's a fact pattern he has to sort out with ESD if he can get through to him, but.
Good luck.
Hey, Bruce, is there any effort at the state level to extend? So just like the federal government has generally been extending the federal piece of this, are there efforts at the state level to do something similar to address scenarios like Debbie just described?
Yeah, I think the governor, I'd have to go back and look, but I believe the governor's already issued proclamations extending the benefits in alignment with the federal extensions. So I'm sort of surprised to hear that somebody's being denied or reduced in their benefits right now.
So, and I know there's a suspension on tax on portion of unemployment compensation as well. That's section 9042. So not an attorney, could totally be wrong, but the way I read that section was that people's unemployment benefits will not be taxed up to a certain point. I think it was $10,200 or something.
Yeah, it is $10,200 for those making under $150,000.
Or $300,000 for a couple?
I believe that's right.
Okay, it's pretty significant. And then there were didn't look like idle advances were going to be taxed either. There's a lot in this bill, a lot of information to know about.
Yeah.
Not only is there a lot of information to know about, but Colleen and I were talking about this before, and I forgot to mention it. There were a lot of things added, quite honestly, at the 11th hour. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, he's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee, which is the tax writing committee, oversaw or was responsible for writing a big piece of this. And Senator Wyden has many rural counties in Oregon, just like there are many rural counties in Washington. And he's been a big champion of secure rural schools and the PILT program, and fights like heck every year, every 2 years to get those programs extended. And it becomes more and more difficult every time they try to do it. And so at the last minute, almost literally at the last minute, he was able to get $2 billion into the bill for what they describe as revenue sharing counties. So counties, I think, that normally receive secure rural schools and or PILT dollars. And he made that a 2-year program. So, and it's 1.5 billion for counties, or 500 million for tribes. And that means for tribes, it's $250 million in 1 year, $250 million in another year. For counties, that means $750 million per year. They were forced to draft it sort of generically. They weren't very prescriptive, because his staff discovered that the more prescriptive they tried to be, the more likely they were to run afoul of the rules that dictate whether you can be included in a reconciliation bill or not. And so they had to make it less prescriptive and leave that up to Treasury. I had a conversation with Senator Wyden about this last week, and the bill passed the Senate. He talked to the Treasury Secretary the next day to explain to her what the intention was when they put that money in there. So look for that money to also flow to counties around the country over the next couple of years as well. And that's significant. $1.5 billion is quite a bit more than secure rural schools and PILT has been funded at the last several years.
Okay, yeah, that I was, there's a lot in that subtitle M, coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. And I was trying to make heads and tails of that. So that is just explaining a lot more. Thanks. Let's see. Debbie also had another question. Oh, I'll get that to you, Debbie, about that particular section. And Council Member Lindsay.
Hi, good morning. I wanted to know, I guess, thinking about this idea of what earmarks Representative Kilmer can put in for his district. What strategy should we employ? If there's only 10, it sounds like we should go with some big earmarks, like combine a bunch of infrastructure together and push it in, but that might make it too big to go through. I don't know, is there any ideas for how to package what we need in a way that'll help to get it through?
It's a great question. And these are things that people all over the country are trying to game out right now. And I'm not sure there are hard and fast answers. So what I'll say is, and I think you hinted at it, I think there is a point at which a request is too big. I've talked to Congressman Kilmer's staff about this, and I've done a lot of research. I've gone back to the appropriations bills from pre-2010 to see what sorts of projects were funded and at what levels. And it does appear that the sweet spot for funding projects is somewhere in the neighborhood or between $500,000 and $2 million. Now there are outliers, right? There are some that are funded at 3 or 5 or maybe even 10, but those are few and far between. And if you really dig into it, the projects that receive that much money tend to have very senior members of Congress who also happen to be members of the Appropriations Committee and just had outsized clout. So I think that the operating assumption is that the sweet spot is between $500,000 and $2 million. And there are, again, only certain accounts from which members can pull money, which means that only certain types of projects can be funded. So if you're looking at transportation, for instance, it includes highway projects, transit projects, and airport projects. But even for airport projects, if you're an airport, you have to be eligible for the airport improvement program. So on the transportation side, there are a lot of restrictions. there are programs through USDA Rural Development. There are programs through EPA. State Tribal Assistance Grants programs is a really good one for water infrastructure. There's a program called HUD EDI, which is a program through HUD that's used for economic development initiatives. Again, low dollar things, but the program has quite a bit of flexibility. It's hard to say. I know Congressman Kilmer. Congressman Kilmer is one of the best. I work with numerous members of Congress, and I'm not saying this just because he's your guy, but the fact is he works really hard to understand the issues that he works on, and works really hard to be fair, right? His district is rather large. It's pretty diverse, and so their plan is to put together a panel of folks from the district that have varying interests that will take a look at all the requests that come in and ultimately make recommendations to him. So it's not, from what I understand, it won't just be him and his staff deciding which projects to put forth. They're going to take a look at a number of factors, right? They're going to take a look at how much money you're requesting. What is the project? Where are you in permitting if that's an issue? Are you able to identify other funds? In other words, is the earmark, is that the last mile? Can you get there with the earmark? When can you actually implement that money? All of these things are going to be taken into account. It's all going to be graded on a curve, and it's all, quite honestly, happening in real time and very quickly. So I'm sure that was clear as mud, but that's sort of where we are with the process.
Mona has a question. Mona?
Good morning. Yes, I do. My consideration is for the public-private partnership. With these projects, are there any advantages when putting these projects forward if you have a private business and a public entity partnership?
There's a lot of advantage for the private company because private companies are not eligible to seek earmarks. So if you are a private organization, and if you are a nonprofit but not a 501c3, then the only way you can be eligible to seek an earmark is to partner with a state, a county, a city, a tribe, or a special district, or a 501c3. Whether or not it makes you more competitive to have a public-private partnership, I think is hard to say, right? Because again, these things are being graded on a curve, and because they are limited to 10, and because you're looking at, appropriations requests that go through the defense bill and appropriations requests for water and wastewater systems and everything in between, it's going to be really hard to, there's going to be a lot of comparing apples to oranges.
Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, the more community support you can show from different stakeholders in your community, the stronger the application is.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. No, there was a couple more questions here in the chat. Let's see, Kai.
Hi, thank you. I've had anecdotal evidence from some business owners that they ran into a situation last year where the employees' state and supplemental federal unemployment actually was more than they would make for working, which for some people was a disincentive for coming back to work. Do you think that is true? Can that happen with a $300, or is there any limitation that the $300 is capped at where the person gets 100% of what they made working when added to the state unemployment?
There was a big, we'll call it a discussion over the summer about the last extension, or maybe 2 extensions ago, of these unemployment benefits. And if you recall, under the CARES Act, the level of federal benefits was much higher. And members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, were hearing from companies, large and small, all over the country that said, look, we need people to come in. And this was especially true for distribution centers around the country, where they needed people in the building, but they were hearing that people were making more on unemployment. Now, how pervasive that was, I just don't know, but it created a political problem. And at the end of the day, sometimes politics can be more important than facts. It's one of the reasons that when the unemployment benefits were extended, they were extended at a lower level. but that number is not based on, well, I think it's largely based on political considerations, what they were able to get, how much it cost, what they were able to get through. It started at $400. Senator Manchin from West Virginia said that was too high, so they took $100 off. At the end of the day, that number was determined, I think, largely because of political convenience and less because of data that shows where the sweet spot was in terms of ensuring that people choose work over unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So, Ray, can I clarify one thing? In the section where there was funding for local governments and tribes, and our state receives a certain bulk amount, and the numbers you provided for the cities and the county, if local governments get any money, does that mean that the counties and cities, when I talk about local governments, I'm talking about special districts like ports, PUDs, et cetera. Does that mean it would come out of that portion of the funds, or would it?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's exactly right. So let's just use the state number as an example. So the state of Washington is estimated to receive roughly $4.25 billion. If the governor decides that he wants to provide X to special districts or other organizations that are eligible under the bill, that means that the state of Washington will then have 4.25 billion minus X. It's a zero-sum game.
Okay. Now, and maybe this is a question for Bruce, but is that really the governor's decision, or could the legislature direct how that funding is going to be distributed, similar to what they did with the last tranche of funding that came from the December 27th $900 billion federal fund, the Consolidated Appropriations Act? Is Bruce still on?
I don't think so. This is Jeannie. I think the legislature thinks that they can distribute it based on conversations that we've had with different members at our local level. Now, whether that's true or not, that's a whole different. But I know that Representative Fye and Representative Hobbs think that they're going to use some of that money for transportation.
Okay. And is that something that the Washington Public Ports Association and Washington PUD Association are trying to influence at all?
I'm not aware of it, but I would imagine they would be.
If they're not yet, I bet they will be soon.
Exactly. But I think that's a good clarifying question on, but I know in the different conversations with the different corners of the legislature, they think that they have the ability to pull some of that money toward different programs, but they also realize that there's lots of legislatures in Washington state that have opinions, and there's lots of programs that need help. So it won't be just transportation, but they believe that it's a legislative opportunity versus a gubernatorial, but that'll be seen.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that as I read this, I see a lot of funding directly coming to entities like the Peninsula Housing Authority and to Serenity House and to libraries and to also there's a lot of funding for what looks like Habitat for Humanity could apply for it. So a lot of, and that's outside of the 4.25 billion that would be coming to the state government, and a lot of funding for childcare. I think from my math, it looks like there will be about $7 million between the different sections of this bill that would come to Clallam County for individuals or certified childcare providers. I'm looking really hard at, is there money for entities like the YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, et cetera, because I know they're losing money every month to the tunes of tens of thousands of dollars. So if there's not specific dedicated money for those organizations, then maybe that's to a, where we need to get organized and be asking the legislature, before they get out of session, to appropriate some of the 4.25 billion that the state is receiving to those needs. And hopefully, you know, then we can fill the gap with the gaps that exist within the county and the cities with the funding that is coming there that way. Go ahead.
So this is Jeannie again. So I guess my question to Ray was how do we learn how those monies will flow? How do we chase the money so we know whether it goes into a program that we should be advising the different nonprofits to apply for in a grant situation, or do we go, you know, will it be funded locally into Department of Commerce at the state level that they'd have to fight it out there? You know, what's your best advice of how to follow those dollars?
Well, if you're talking about the $350 billion nationally and for state and local, then I think it's really about talking to the state, the counties, and the cities that are receiving money and trying to get a sense of what they plan to do with that money. To the extent that money is being distributed outside of the state and local, but to other uses, you know, you go into the bill and determine which agency that money is flowing through. And then each of these agencies have COVID relief pages that provide guidance for all of the programs that are either stood up or receiving money. And those websites, the ones I've seen at least, whether it's Treasury or other departments, are pretty good about providing Q's and A's and other guidance as far as how the money is going to flow. They're not quick about posting that information, but when the information is available, I've found it to be useful. But if you're talking about the state and local stuff, I would go straight to the governor, the county commissioners, the mayors, whomever it is that will, or that we presume will be responsible for distributing their piece of the pie.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Does anyone have any additional questions here? Have I missed any?
I see a hand from Mr. Fleck.
Rod.
So not only did he age me by like 40 years with that, but okay. So the question I've got, Ray, is just a clarification. So the 4.25, I think you said, billion coming into the state, that's going to go to state and then counties and cities. If the governor wanted to, let's say it this way. If the governor wanted to allocate portions of that to transportation projects, to ports, to things that are exciting to him, that would come off the top, that would then come down to the city. So the $844,000 to Forks, for example, could be reduced by the governor's actions, right?
No, I don't believe so.
No. Oh, okay.
I believe,
okay.
And I will
right,
say,
so.
No, I don't think so. I don't know to what extent the county and city money will flow through the state. It may not. I'd have to go back to the bill. I do know, and if I remember correctly, I think there are two distinct sections in the bill that separate this money. I think one section was states, territories, Washington, D.C., and tribes. And the tribal money will not go through the state. The Treasury will do that independently. Okay. And then there's an entirely separate section that covers the counties and the big cities and the small cities. So I would read that to mean the money will go directly from Treasury to those local units of government, and the state won't have any opportunity. And each of those pots of money are also distributed in different ways based on population or other metrics.
Okay. All right. Again, Audrey heard that right. I did not. So.
Yep. And I call everyone Mr. and Mrs. by the way. I grew up in the Midwest. I was raised to be polite.
I'm just teasing you, Ray.
So Lena, you had another question?
Yes, thank you. So I am curious, Colleen, about any references to the PPP or EIDL or any of the other grants that that may have been included in the bill. But specifically, when talking about potential tax increases for businesses and individuals, you briefly mentioned that. Has there been any discussion on whether or not any increases would be retroactive to 2021, or are we thinking that that's going to be 2022 and later? As we know, many of the items, including the unemployment issue, was retroactive to 2020, and as a tax preparer, it makes it challenging to plan for taxes. So I'm expecting that there will be tax increases. President Biden has mentioned that, but I'm curious if there's been any discussion on when those would be effective.
So I'm sorry, the question was about when the loans would come due?
No. When would tax increases go into effect? Would that be for the tax year of 2021, 2022? Is there any discussion there?
I think that's difficult to predict, but I think a general rule of thumb is that if it were to happen in the first half of the year, I think there's a chance it could be retroactive. I think if it happens in the second half of the year, I think that it applies to the next calendar year. And I will say that if this, I think you're going to see this happen. I think it's the only way to pay for infrastructure or whatever big initiative they want to do next. I also think that it's going to happen much later in the year, more like October, November, December. And so the question is, does it go into effect immediately on January 1? I just don't know. It depends on how they write the bill. But if it's late in the year, I think for just planning purposes, I know that the federal government likes to complicate things, but they, I think, would have it look forward rather than look backwards.
Okay, well, I think with that, it is 9:01. I'm gonna call it a morning. I commit to everyone, I will have this up on our website, the different information and links to different sections by close of business Friday. So if you go to chooseclallamfirst.com, you'll be able to find the information there. And hopefully that will answer a lot of your detailed questions. However, there is going, then the agencies receive the money and then there's more detail that'll come out. But for planning purposes, I think that's really important. So thank you so much, Ray, and the Port of Port Angeles for allowing Ray to spend his time with us today. I hope it's been helpful to everyone. All right, well, have a great day, and most of all, happy St. Patrick's Day. Thanks,
Colleen.
Thanks.